Well, the origins of the Aryans, as you know, is a very hotly debated subject indeed. Whether they originated in India, as some people like to believe, or whether they invaded or migrated from Iran and Central Asia and so on, is still uncertain. Most of what we know about the Aryans is based on the language, on Sanskrit, and in the relationship of Sanskrit to other Indo-European languages probably depends all that we can are likely to learn about the Vedic Aryan people.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Yeah. Namaste. I'm Mithilesh and Sumit. Welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us veteran historian Sri John Keay on our show. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Today we'll discuss John's book, India, a History. India as a subcontinent is described as every historian's dream because of its rich and diverse culture. The author narrates stories regarding various historical events and people who have made a mark or contributed to the transformation of India all these years, making the country what it is in the present day. India History, the revised edition, was published on 22nd July 2010. The book employs a fluent and simple language, and author has documented Indian history vividly. It is ideal for students and other enthusiasts who wish to know more about the past and present of India. John Keay, FRGS, is a British historian, journalist, radio presenter, and lecturer specializing in popular histories of India, the Far East, and China. He is widely seen as a preeminent historian of British India. So, John, how did India a History, the book, happen?
Well, as you say, it was quite a while ago. It was in, I actually wrote the first edition of India History in the 1990s. And it was commissioned by my then publisher, HarperCollins. And it was actually their idea. And I was quite reluctant to take on such a mammoth task. And I didn't really feel totally qualified. But they were very insistent that I had written something on 19th century scholarship about India. So I knew a little bit, and I'd also worked in India as a journalist and as a travel writer and so on. So eventually I was persuaded and I took it on, and it was, as you say, published. The first edition was published in the year 2000. Since then, it's been, well, the first edition was reprinted at least 12 times in the first 3 or 4 years, and it's been reprinted, re-edited in various editions quite frequently since. And so actually at the moment I'm just preparing what will be the third edition for the press, and this will come out later in this year, 2022. Each edition is updated, so they contain quite a lot of new material, but mostly in the sense of updating the chronology, so it brings it forward to the present rather than in terms of what research has been done on the subject in the interim. And so these are updated but not entirely rewritten works. The next edition will be again in paperback, as a single volume, but it'll also be in hardback as 2 volumes because the thing is getting a bit big for a single volume now. But anyway, I mean, it has done extremely well, and it's become really well established, rather than the same way as my China history has too. And both are very challenging and interesting. It's interesting to compare them too. But anyway, I mean, I've written quite a lot of other books, but these are the 2 books which probably I'm best known for.
Yep. So thank you. So I would like to reveal the book to my audience. So it's not that much arcane. It's well-known book, and everyone has. I think I know have one uh, gone through this book. So I'll recommend my audience or viewers who have not gone through. If you want to have one single book and a well-researched book on Indian history, so this is the go-to book for everyone. So yeah. So thank you for coming up such a wonderful book.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Yes. So now we'll go into the book chapters. So you suggested that late Harappan civilization lasted up to 1700 BC. What
Yes.
happened to the indigenous people after that?
I'm sorry?
So you have suggested that late
Yes.
Harappan civilization lasted till 1700 BC.
Yes.
Then what happened indigenous people after that?
Well, this is one of the problems with Indian history is there are great kind of gaps where the record, insofar as we can establish it, is very vague, and quite often one simply has to admit we don't know. The demise of the Harappan civilization has been shifted. The date has been shifted from time to time, and now, as you say, stands at around 1700 BC. But how this Harappan or Indus Valley civilization related to the Aryan tradition is still very hotly debated. And whether the uh, Aryans, the Vedic peoples, were preceded, coincided, or followed the Harappan civilization is still debated. And I don't pretend to lay down the law on this, and I know some people feel very strongly about it. But by and large, it's assumed that the Harappans were followed by the Vedic peoples, and so and their civilization, Harappa's civilization, more or less disappeared. In the case of the main sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, both of which are in Pakistan now, of course, it's thought that they were probably inundated by some flood of the Indus River. But all the other Harappan settlements scattered over an enormous area, of course, right up into Afghanistan and into Punjab and UP and so on. These may have continued to preserve something of Harappan civilization much later than the major cities did. But again, they don't give many clues as to what possible relationship they may have had with the Aryan Vedic peoples.
Well, the Aryans were the nomads who migrated from a region near Caspian Sea to
well,
towards India.
well, the origins of the Aryans, as you know, is a very hotly debated subject indeed. Whether they originated in India, as some people like to believe, or whether they invaded or migrated from Iran and Central Asia and so on, is still uncertain. Most of what we know about the Aryans is based on the language, on Sanskrit, and in the relationship of Sanskrit to other Indo-European languages probably depends all that we can are likely to learn about the Vedic Aryan people. I personally, I think in the first editions of India history, I confidently said, "Oh, the Aryans had migrated or invaded India in around about 1500 BC." But now that would be hotly contested, I think, and I think in later editions, or certainly in the new edition, this has been qualified, and I happily accept the fact that we still don't know enough to pontificate on where the Aryans came from or when. So there's a lot of Indian history still to be discovered, and in a way, that's what's so exciting about writing Indian history. Is it isn't all cut and dried like might be the case with, say, English history. There's a great deal of room for speculation and for new theories and so on, and I find that fascinating.
You talk about the differences between your new volume, which you are currently writing, and the second edition. which you have already written in 2010. So what are the differences between the two books? I'm sure, as you say, the newer edition is going to be bigger, as you have already mentioned. So what are the major differences, things you have added in the new edition?
Well, I mean, the major differences are in the updating of the chronological narrative. So, whereas the first edition ended in the 1990s, the second edition carried the story forward to 2010 or thereabouts, and then this new edition that I'm working on at the moment will take it forward to right through the Modi years to now to 2022. So in each case, 2 or 3 chapters have had to be added at the end of the book, and those are the major additions. But there are places where obviously I've had to correct something I said in the past, which is not necessarily accepted, and then there are other places where I wasn't really happy with bits of it, so I have revised it. But the main thing is the final chapters in the second edition and this new third edition, which will be new, completely new. I find crossing from history into what we might call current affairs quite difficult. It's always a challenge for anyone writing history, and most historians sensibly stop well before the year in which they're actually writing. But because India history, the book has established itself, and so many people complain when they pick up an old copy and say it doesn't bring the story up to date, that I thought, well, I should bring it up to date, and there's no reason why one can't do it. The trouble with writing contemporary history or current affairs, of course, you don't have access to all the materials that you would have for earlier history, so that archives are not open, letters have not been published, and so on. So it's a bit more speculative than it would be when you're writing about earlier history. And also, you don't have that sort of pool of accepted ideas, which you have in terms of, say, 18th and 19th century history, which and you don't have for the 20th and 21st century. So it's a slightly dangerous thing to do, but I think on the whole, it's worth a try. I mean, the updating.
What are the major revisions which happened in understanding the, let's say, before Christ, the history before the birth of Christ, essentially the BC? Do we get any new archaeological or literary evidence that changed our understanding of Indian history in that period, in the last decade?
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of the Harappan civilization, there's been an awful. I mean, we didn't even know it existed in the 1920s, and it's all the whole reconstruction of the Harappan world has been the work of 20th and now 21st century archaeology, and is still ongoing. So certainly in terms of early history, we're still learning a lot. In terms of more recent history, I don't know. I mean, I said confidently at the beginning of the introduction to the first edition of India history that there were no chronicles of Indian history in the same way as we have for most European histories. No kind of medieval chronicles and records and so on. But actually, the more I know about the subject, the more I'm slightly doubtful about this. The big exception is a work by a Kashmiri Brahmin, which was written in the 8th century, called this man was called Kalhana, and he wrote a work called the Raja Tarangini, which is actually a genuine chronicle. I mean, it's and a very interesting. I've actually been reading it just recently, and I find it absolutely fascinating. But this is the exception. But it's and because such chronicles are so rare, even the Raja Tarangini hasn't been very closely studied until, certainly until the 20th century, and even now people are still working on it. So there are materials that still have to be, this is obviously documentation, but also there are inscriptions and so on that are being turned up all the time, which are telling us more about particularly kind of what we might call medieval India, pre-Mughal, pre-Islamic India. So there is new material coming along all the time, and in a way, I mean, I often get described as a historian. I don't think I am a historian. I consider myself a history writer. I think historians are people who devote their lives to a particular period of history or aspect of history and write exclusively on it and teach it and so on. And I've never pretended to be a historian in that sense. And indeed, a lot of the great historians in the English language tradition, people like Edward Gibbon and Thomas Carlyle and Macaulay and so on, were not historians in the present, in the sense we understand the word today. They too were history writers. They were as much writers as historians. And I think the writing of history is just as important as the history itself, and that there's always a room for the history writer, in other words, for the generalist, if you like, looking at history rather than devoting his entire time to the archives.
As you mentioned, in the all the challenges writing about Indian history is, or even doing research, is the absence of literary evidence.
Yes.
And so, why is that? Is it because of the lack of culture, or is it because many of the books were actually written and they are lost and can't be found?
I don't know. I mean, to me, having written a history, a 5,000-year history of China as well as of India, it's quite interesting to compare the two, because the Chinese history is reconstructed almost entirely from documentation. The Chinese were writing their history, recording it, rewriting it from the very earliest times, and we have, if anything, too much documentation for Chinese history. The opposite seems to be true of Indian history, and the explanations for this. I mean, the obvious sort of glib thing was that Indians were not so interested in their past as say the Chinese. They were not trying to justify the present in terms of the past in the same way as the Chinese did and still do. And maybe there's something in that. I don't see why, though. I don't think there's any obvious explanation, and certainly I didn't discover one for this absence of documentation. You could say it's had something to do with, materials not writing materials and paper and so on not lasting very long in a warm climate and so on. But I don't know. I don't think there's any simple explanation. All people are different. Some people take their beliefs much more seriously, and some people take their history much more seriously.
Yeah. So going back to Indus Valley, the Indus script has not been deciphered yet. Also, prior to 6th century BC, the literary evidence is scant. Is it because the Aryans were learning how to formalize writing, or because the lack of writing of literary evidence?
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. That the Indus Valley or Harappan script still remains a complete mystery, although various theories have been put forward about it. And I think it would be very rash to say it will never be deciphered, but at the moment it isn't. And so there's, again, great room for speculation. We're not even quite sure whether it is writing. I mean, they use these ideograms, these characters on the seals, particularly the seals were stamped in clay to record. We don't know what the script seems to be. If it is a script, seems to be used for trading purposes, for mercantile purposes. Perhaps it's just some system of logos identifying a particular cargo or something, and we really don't know what the hell it is. I think probably we will one day, but despite a lot of work on it and some extremely brilliant scholars, and of course the use of computers and so on, it's still a very, very uncertain. And what what connection it might have with later scripts like the Ashoka Brahmi script and so on is very uncertain. Very few links have been drawn between these characters used by the Harappans, these written characters, and the inscriptions of Ashoka, for instance.
In your book, you talk about the short chronology of Buddhism and how it actually helps
Oh yes.
smoothen or essentially smoothen or connecting the dots pre-Buddha and post-Buddha if you take the short chronology. So, I mean, how are we doing there? I mean, is there more evidence that short chronology is um, there's more evidence for that?
I mean, an awful lot of dates in early Indian history are based on the parinirvana, the death of the Buddha. And so the date at which he actually died is very important to establish in order to verify other dates after it. And it has been, it was originally supposed to have been in, I can't remember the exact date, it's somewhere in the 5th century, and it's now more often, somewhere in the 6th century, it's now more often placed in the 5th century BCE. So that this readjustment of the birth of the death of the parinirvana, his transference to nirvana of the original Buddha affects the whole of early Indian history and the dates even of Ashoka, for instance. And so every time it gets shifted, then everything has to be moved. And the shorter chronology is just it doesn't mean to say it's it doesn't mean to say time is actually being affected. It just means that the Buddha's parinirvana has been shifted forward again rather than backward. And that affects all these other dates, and it's called the shorter chronology. And that seems to be the prevailing one at the moment. But I mean, the difference between the earliest dates and the latest dates is about 100 years, which is not that much in terms of BCE history. Obviously, as I say, it affects the dates of other things, but it doesn't change the whole progression of early Indian history.
In your book, you suggest that the Ramayana happened after Mahabharata, right? Because you say that in Ramayana there is a more developed sense of kingdom, plus the
Yes.
geography which is described is more elaborate and is more wider compared to the geography which is in Mahabharata. But that is very contrary to what Hindus believe, because they believe that Ramayana actually happened in the second yuga and Mahabharata happened after that in third yuga, and we are in the Kali Yuga. So how do we, how do we connect these two, where the Hindu beliefs are very different? They believe the Ramayana happened earlier than Mahabharata, and your book you actually say it's actually the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, as we know them today, are of course compilations of over many centuries, and they were only written down. I can't remember exactly, but long after they had been composed, and when they were composed, they may have been referring to events much earlier than that even. So we're talking about a very long span of years during which these epics have been put together, and a lot of material has been incorporated into them in the process, and other material has probably been lost. And so when we talk about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana today, we're talking about texts which have developed over a very long period of time and which have been altered, added to, and subtracted to from during that period. It seems fairly certain from textual study of them that the Mahabharata is the older. But if we don't know exactly how much older, and if we don't know how much of that material was actually original and how much was incorporated subsequently, it's very difficult to establish an order of precedence between the two. But of course, the obvious thing is that the geography is quite different. The Mahabharata is set in what's now Punjab mostly, and the Ramayana includes much of central and south India as well. So that whoever the people were who first composed it or composed these epics or treasured them clearly had slightly different geographical perspectives, and that seems to possibly coincide with a process of what's been called Aryanization of central and southern India in early times. But as I say, these are both works are really compilations over a very, very long period of time, and so it's difficult to draw any conclusions in terms of their respective chronologies. I'm sorry, I'm not always answering your questions, but you have to accept that Indian history is still, very much up for grabs, and it's changing all the time. And so one has to be a little bit cautious. I can't pontificate on something that I'm not totally confident about, particularly when there are a lot of people who happily differ from it.
No, we are absolutely comfortable with that. We understand that research is always evolving. You get more evidence. You can only talk about what's there in the facts, right? You can't just
Yes.
create.
And this is particularly true of early history. I mean, we're talking most about early Indian history, and this is a very, it's altogether a very contentious subject. It's very difficult to be absolutely confident about anything to do with it.
So coming back to Ashoka, the great Mauryan Ashoka. So during Ashoka time, the boundary of India was one of the largest boundary India has ever had, but after the Ashoka it collapsed, and the similar thing happens after the Aurangzeb. So can we draw any parallel between why Aurangzeb collapsed and why Ashoka collapsed? Is due to their over control or broadening the larger territory? Is it so, or some other region?
Well, in the case of Ashoka and the Maurya Empire, of course, we're entirely dependent, almost completely dependent on inscriptions in stone. And what we know is derived of Ashoka is derived entirely from his pillar and rock inscriptions. And these were inscribed during a comparatively short time. And what happened before and what happened after is much less certain. The idea that Ashoka ruled, or his dominion extended to the whole of the Indian subcontinent, is based obviously on where these inscriptions are found. And if there were no inscriptions had been found in Bengal, for instance, then it's a little bit uncertain whether Bengal was ever part of the Mauryan Empire or not. So it's when we talk about the Ashoka Empire, we're just reflecting on the distribution and the content of these inscriptions, and after the disintegration of the Mauryan Empire, Indian history enters a very difficult period from the point of view of a historian. You have so many different dynasties competing in different parts of the country. That most history books actually of India, they do a fantastic skip from Ashoka to Akbar almost, from with perhaps a nod to a Gupta empire between, from the Mauryas to the Mughals. And I always thought this was a bit ridiculous, and that I should try and engage with what was happening in the interim. And even at the risk of losing all your readers and presenting something that was totally incomprehensible, I thought it was important. Apart from anything else, so many of the great monuments and temple complexes and so on were the product of this kind of what scholars used to call the Dark Ages, this long interim between these periods of pan-Indian dominion of the Mauryas and the Mughals. And as I say, this period is interesting archaeologically and in terms of culture generally. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to sort out all these various, mostly regional dynasties in the early centuries of the Common Era, right through to the Islamic period. And perhaps the book loses its readers in the process. But anyway, I found them interesting. As someone who'd actually spent quite a lot of time traveling in India before writing this book, as I say, I was a political journalist for a bit, and also edited a guidebook and so on. And I was terribly aware that most people's idea of India's past, really didn't extend much further back than Mughals and the Taj Mahal and so on, and that actually the earlier periods were much more, well, not more interesting, but were certainly worth some study. And so I noted, all these wonderful temples, particularly in the south and in the Deccan and in central India. And the other odd thing about all this sort of architectural heritage too is it doesn't always match up to the great empires that we know about. So that so many of the great temple complexes, like Khajuraho, for instance, was the work not of a major dynasty, but of a quite local and not particularly politically significant line of kings in the Chandelas in UP now. The correlation between India's architecture and its history is not as obvious as it seems when you look at the Mughals, for instance, and the great works of Mughal architecture. And that seems to me to justify directing a bit more attention and consideration to some of these lesser dynasties during the first millennium CE of the Common Era.
Well, continuing with that, so the Buddhism in India was at its eminence during Ashoka and after that also. But after Ashoka, after fall of Mauryan Empire and during Gupta periods, Buddhism in India almost disappeared, and it was protected in some pockets like in Pala, in Bengal,
Yes.
and
Yeah, indeed, yes, yes.
So, what was the reason of this disappearance? Is it rise of Hindu or foreign invasion from Muslim power?
Yes, I think a kind of a revival of what we now call Hinduism was certainly partly responsible. I think that Buddhism spread in a sort of rather distinctive fashion in India. It was very much closely associated with trade and exchange, and it tended to, well, in terms of the monuments and cave temples and so on, it tended to follow trade routes. And as in periods when trade was apparently in decline, and so much of India was being fought over by all these individual dynasties I was talking about, that maybe the patronage on which the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community depended, that the investment on which they depended rather began to dry up. But as you say, Buddhism lingered on well into the Islamic period in Bengal, particularly, but also in Nepal, for instance, and then eventually in Tibet. And in a curious way, I think Tibetan Buddhism is the successor, the sole remaining successor, really, of ancient Indian Buddhism, because elsewhere, even in China, it's no longer particularly important. This is I'm talking about the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. The Hinayana, the Theravada tradition, of course, is quite different, and that spread from India to Sri Lanka and then to Southeast Asia, and there had a very illustrious and continuous existence. But in India, Buddhism was complete. I mean, if you take a site like Bodh Gaya in Bihar, I mean, this is where the Buddha attained enlightenment. And it was obviously one of the most crucial Buddhist sites. But it was largely, it was also, the Buddha was absorbed in a sense by Hinduism in that the Buddha was taken as one of the avatars of Lord Vishnu, and Bodh Gaya became then a Hindu site, a site of Hindu pilgrimage. And the only Buddhists who seem to have found their way to Bodh Gaya in, say, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries were from outside India, from places like Myanmar and Thailand. So Buddhism was not so much suppressed. I mean, there are very few examples of Hindu-Buddhist conflict. It was more a question of Buddhism never having strayed that far from Hinduism, being reabsorbed by it over the course of time, and with the loss of patronage of royal or imperial support for the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist community, the Buddhist monastic community. Does that help? Does that help at all?
Yeah, it's all very interesting for sure. I mean, coming to, I mean, so we know that, I mean,
Sorry, who?
Under Ummayyad dynasty, Muhammad bin Qasim attacked Sindh, and then he defeated Raja Tahir. So you do see a Muslim invasion which started somewhere around 700 AD, and then that lasted up until the defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan by Muhammad Ghori, right? So you see the Muslim invasions, they were very successful, which was mostly directed either from the Central Asia or from the Persian, which was Umayyad dynasty, which mostly they were centered around in the Iran, right? So, but prior to that, prior to the origin of Islam or the Muslim in the central in the Middle East, we don't see the Persians being that successful that they actually entered, crossed the Indus and entered the mainland of India. What would be the reason for that?
I don't think we're talking about Persians here. I don't know where the Persians have crept in. But these were Arabs. The caliphate in Baghdad was an Arab caliphate, and it was the Arab caliphate's armies or troops who invaded Sindh in the 8th century CE, and who indeed also into Afghanistan. So they were Sunni Muslims, not Shia Persians. I mean, there may have been Shia Persians involved, but it was the Baghdad Caliphate was definitely Arab and Sunni. And it was, we talk about the Muslim invasion of India, but it was a very, very protracted process. The incursions into Sindh, which you're talking about, were in the 8th and 9th centuries. Muhammad of Ghazni, who invaded India repeatedly and destroyed so many temples and so on, that was in the 11th century. And it was only really in the 13th century, in the 1200s, that Islam spread dramatically, particularly down through Bihar and into Bengal. So it's a period of years from say 800 to 1200, 400 years, 4 centuries of gradual encroachment by the Islamic powers. And at each period of incursions during this 400 years, there were different priorities, and different factors were crucial. The invasion of Sindh in the 8th and 9th centuries by these Arab forces from Baghdad also, of course, extended into Afghanistan, and the last Hindu dynasty in Kabul was toppled by these Arabs in that earlier period. Then you have a long gap of gradual encroachment, but really nothing much changes until about 1000 AD, when this Mahmud of Ghazni, the Great Destroyer, begins making almost annual, yearly incursions into northern and western India. The great temple at Somnath is destroyed, and these very iconoclastic Muslim armies begin draining Indian temples of all their wealth and so on. And this was probably the worst period of all, but it was comparatively short. I mean, Mahmud of Ghazni only lasted 20 years or so. And after him, there was again a lull. And then under the first Delhi sultans, in the first Delhi Muslim rulers, first of Delhi's Muslim rulers, the sultans, Islamic Muslim armies were directed to different parts of India, and then it's that period that you get another phase of vandalization and attacks on Hindu centers of pilgrimage and so on. So then that's in the 1200s, and of course the great invasions of Alauddin Khalji into southern India, into what's now Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and so on, also in this later phase. So there are really 3 major phases of Islamization or Islamic interventions in India. And then, of course, the Mughals later. But so, I mean, yes, Islamic penetration went on over a very long period, and was not always particularly disastrous. We know a lot of temples were destroyed, but a lot weren't destroyed. The main targets seem to have been places of pilgrimage, or places where a great deal of wealth had been accumulated. Places like Mathura, for instance, and Somnath I mentioned, and Varanasi to some extent. But in a lot of other great temples were not touched at all. A lot of existing Hindu rulers were left in control of their particular territories and empires, and so it's very difficult to generalize over such a long period. And in a way, the idea of a sort of Islamic conquest of India in around the 10,000 to 1200 AD is rather misleading. It started much earlier, and it went on a lot longer, and it wasn't always as disastrous as it appeared to be under during the years of Muhammad of Ghazni.
So this is about Vijayanagara Empire. So we know that Vijayanagara Empire was really big in the south, and they crumbled after the Battle of Talikota, in which they lost. So would you
Yes.
say that was the Vijayanagara Empire crumbling? Was it very circumstantial because of this one event, or it was inevitable to crumble?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, it's a very. We really need to know. Someone needs to write a really good study of the Vijayanagara Empire, and it doesn't really exist at the moment. At least I'm not aware of it. Certainly, I mean, if you go to Hampi, you've probably been there. The remains of the city and so on are so impressive that you can't really doubt the fact that this was a mighty empire, but it was quite short-lived, and the idea that Vijayanagara was exclusively Hindu in today's terms, and that most of its opponents were Muslim is also misleading. Politics and religion in the Deccan and in the south were never quite as simple as that. The great the Bahmanid sultans of Bijapur and Golconda and so on were totally dependent on troops which were very often Hindu, and indeed the opposite applies too. The Vijayanagara kingdom employed Muslim troops, and it wasn't. I don't think one should see it in terms of the Islamic conquest or anything. Vijayanagara would probably collapse eventually anyway. It was. Although it was a vast empire in its time and obviously magnificent, we have, of course, being comparatively late, we do also have some kind of European witnesses of the court and life in Hampi. But I think it didn't represent. One wants to make comparisons, say, with the Marathas and with Shivaji, but it wasn't like that. The Vijayanagara was not, as far as we can tell, was not insistently Hindu, was not resisting a Muslim conquest in the same way as you might characterize Shivaji. So it was a magnificent creation. It didn't last very long, and it doesn't really fit into the usual narrative of Hindu-Muslim conflict.
Well, so this question actually widely debated in India today. That was Akbar a great emperor?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Was Akbar a great emperor of India?
Akbar, yes. I mean, he's a fascinating character, and again, he doesn't really fit very well into the Hindu-Muslim conflict narrative. I mean, he wasn't really a Muslim either. I mean, he developed this faith of his own, which centered on the person of the emperor himself, and scandalized a lot of his divines and mullahs and so on. But in terms of as a military ruler and as administrator, he was exceptional. Very, I mean, you must have been to Patipur Sikri and seen where he had conducted these sort of open forums on religions where representatives of Christians and Muslims and Jains and Sikhs could all compete in a sort of great debate as to which was the true religion or the greater religion. So he was a man with a very open kind of mind, but and certainly wasn't again doesn't fit that narrative of perpetual conflict and antagonism between Muslims and Hindus.
So what was the reason behind the fall of Mughals? Is it rise of Maratha or rise of British?
Well, of course, it was both. The Mughal Empire, I mean, really collapsed from internal pressures as much as anything, too. I mean, it just got too big, really. Places like Hyderabad and Bengal and so on were vast enterprises and sapped so much of the Mughals' energies that it was, there was this famous man called, well, he wasn't called, no one knew what he was called, but he was eventually called Murshid Quli Khan, who founded the city of Murshidabad in Bengal, who was appointed by Aurangzeb, I think it was, as his Diwani, as his chancellor, if you like, or chief minister in Bengal, and slowly established a really effective government, and then managed to get his Diwani made into a kind of hereditary post, and he passed it on to his son. And eventually, in the course of a couple of decades, Bengal was in effect an independent kingdom or nawabship within the Mughal Empire. And this same process was going on in the same time in places like Hyderabad. So that the Mughal Empire was splitting apart, and revenues were ceasing to reach the emperor in Delhi, and who anyway was having a pretty rough time trying to keep out, particularly the Afghans, Abdali, and who repeatedly invaded Delhi in the early 18th century. The Marathas were, of course, also a problem, and the British too. But I think that to explain the collapse of the Mughal Empire purely in terms of those who profited from it, i.e., the East India Company and the Marathas, would be a mistake. I mean, the thing was falling apart of its own. Aurangzeb was hardly, I mean, he had long reign, but he was hardly ever in Delhi. He was campaigning almost the entire time in the Deccan, and really rather neglecting the conduct of the empire. When he died, inevitably the succession was disputed, and as I say, these large sections of the empire started breaking away. So that's just as important.
The growth of India, I mean, after the British left, had been very slow until 1990s, after which the Indian economy really took off, which definitely led to modernization and liberalization in India. So, what do you think about modern India? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yes. Well, modern India is a new place. It's, I mean, although history can tell us a certain amount about the present. I don't think it tells us very much about modern India. I think modern India is a fantastic creation, and it's. I mean, every time I go there, it's like visiting a new country. I first went. I first came to India in the 1960s. I think it was. Yes, it was late 1960s, and I suppose I've been going almost every year for one reason or another ever since. And each time it's like visiting a totally different country. Things have changed so much, and I think, I mean, it's so exciting. Uh, uh, India is is actually cutting away from its past, I think, at the moment, and changing into something quite different. And I don't think there'll ever be another edition of, no, not by me anyway, of India history. And so I'm quite relieved at that because I don't know how I'd handle it. The economic growth has been sensational. And inevitably there are hiccups along the way. And, not every year is there going to be 10% GDP growth or something, but it's still growth there will be, and it is changing. It must be very exciting to be an Indian in the 21st century. I think if I was going to be born again somewhere fairly soon, I think I'd choose to be born again in India.
Well, that's I mean, really great to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I mean, reincarnation, right? I mean, we believe in reincarnation. I don't know how much do you believe in that, but
You haven't asked me the obvious question. I'll ask it myself. You know what Gandhi said? I think I can't remember when it was. It's in one of his writings. He says the trouble with the British is that they're always writing other people's histories, and I've always been slightly embarrassed about this and saying, "Well, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing, and I write other people's histories." But I don't think that because you're outside a country, you can't write its history. And I think I would welcome the idea of more Indians writing British history or European history or American history. I think, in a way, a little bit of distance between uh, the place you're writing about and the writer is rather a good thing. And whether it's a distance of time, you're looking back through the centuries, or whether you're looking in from outside, doesn't really make much difference. I think to be, I think what the trouble with Indian history at the moment is it's become too vulnerable to partisan causes of one sort or another, and in a way, outsiders are perhaps in a better position to write dispassionately about India or China's history comes to that than Indians or Chinese. So I'm not too embarrassed by Mahatma Gandhi's uh, accusing Englishmen of writing other people's history. I think we should all write other people's history, and I'd like to see more of it.
absolutely. I mean, I don't see. I mean, we don't see any problem with that because
Good.
I mean, being born in country. I mean, obviously you have some advantages when you write about your own country, but it also brings biasness. I think
Yes,
when
exactly.
someone writes about your own, a third party writes about, someone from third country writes
Yeah.
uh, about India, I think they bring a fresh perspective. Yes, it could be that they are also biased by something, but hopefully biasness about your country and biasness about other country
Yeah.
cancels each
Yeah.
other out, and we get kind of a neutral version.
Yes. I think another thing that I'd like to see in Indian history is much more regional history. I mean, I've been writing about the whole country all the time, but actually, the country is made up of so many very distinctive regions and communities and so on. And uh, there are comparatively few regional histories. A really good history of Bengal, for instance, um, or of the South or something would be, or uh, um, um, uh, Punjab, Rajasthan, and so on, would be really useful. I think there's a lot of work for history writers still in India, particularly in terms of writing. I'm thinking of writing a history of Kashmir next, but whether I'll ever get around to it, I don't know. But I would like to. That's why I'm reading the Raja Tarangini of Kalhana.
What else are you working on?
What else am I working? Well, I have a new book coming out later this year. The text is more or less finished. It's just going through production at the moment, and it's a book on the greater Himalayan region. It's called Himalaya, Exploring the Roof of the World. And so it's a study of the whole mountain region from roughly Arunachal right around to northern Pakistan, Gilgit-Baltistan region, and the whole of Tibet, of course. And it's a bit different. It's not really a history. It's more a study of the region, and it looks at the ecology and environment and so on as much as the past. Anyway, the book is grinding its way through production at the moment, and I think it'll be published in September this year by Bloomsbury. And then, as I say, I'm also thinking about a book on Kashmir, and I'm revising this new edition of India history, which will come out in also in the end of August, September, I think. So those are the three things that I'm working on at the moment. But I don't know why, actually. I mean, it's about time I stopped, really. I've been writing books for since my first book was called Into India, and it was a little introduction to India, and it was published in 1973, I think. So I've been writing for a long time, and I should have retired long ago, but then I couldn't think what I was going to do in retirement. The idea of retiring I just like writing, so I should go on writing, but I don't know what I'll do until I can't see anymore, or can't hear anything at all, or become incapacitated in some way.
I mean, we wish that you continue to write for long more years. I mean, we definitely.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope what we've recorded is of some use to the Eastern Report.
Thank you. Thanks for coming to our channel at such a short notice and discussing about your book. We look forward to inviting you again when you're.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
See you.
Namaste.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.